A few hundred miles above our heads exists a near-perfect vacuum. In space, the temperature can swing wildly, hundreds of degrees between sunlight and darkness, and there are few gravitational forces exerted on the human body. This is a place incompatible with human life. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human emissary to this hostile frontier. And just a few short years later, in 1969, the astronauts of Apollo 11 embarked on humanity's most spectacular voyage yet. Soon we'll be back to the moon, this time to stay, and then to Mars and worlds beyond. The late 20th century saw an impressive suite of robotic explorers. From probes sent to the outer reaches of our solar system, to the drills and lasers of our most advanced Martian rovers. They have taught us incredible things about the universe that we live in. But no robot can compare to the human explorer. Our intuition, our senses, our ability to dig our fingers into the soil of another planet will tell us incredible things about the universe that we live in, and even our home back here on Earth. The new space race upon which we are embarking will be a challenging, difficult, and at times scary endeavor, but an endeavor worth undertaking. This week on Giant Leap, we're going to explore the future of human spaceflight, where we're going, how we'll get there, and what the challenges will be.
Giant Leap with Taylor Wilson.
Go, Lovato, go, guidance, go, control, go, Telcom, go, GNC, go, Ecom, go, Surgeon, go, Capcom, we're go for landing.
It's one small step for man.
Welcome to Giant Leap. I'm your host, Taylor Wilson, and we're here with my producer, Joey Lovato.
I'm a journalist. Taylor is a nuclear physicist. We are here in Taylor's lab, and today we're talking about space.
One of my favorite topics, Joey.
I know you love space, Taylor. There are a lot of subcategories of space to get into. And today, I have a question for you, which is, what is the future of human spaceflight look like?
Well, the future of human spaceflight is bright. I think we're entering a golden era of human space exploration. We spent the 20th century exploring the moon and the Apollo program, and then low Earth orbit with the space shuttle program, the International Space Station. And there were these series of amazing robotic missions, Voyager, Viking, the Curiosity and Perseverance rovers. And they've told us a lot about our universe, but I think we finally have the tools and technologies available that will allow us to go back to the moon and stay this time and go onwards to Mars and the outer solar system, and do that with humans. And that is a very exciting future that I am excited to take part in.
Taylor, one of my favorite movies is Interstellar, but recently I've been watching like the Alien movies, and I just watched a lesser known sci-fi movie called Sunshine. Those movies are making me not really want to go to space very much. Something that I'm not really interested in doing. I'm pretty happy here on Earth, but would you be willing to get up there?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, right? Like maybe not some suborbital mission or, a jaunt to low Earth orbit, but I think, if I could go to the moon or to Mars and get to do real science, I think I would definitely be game for that. But I would want a return ticket, that's for sure. Yeah.
Well, if I went to space, I don't know if I could be doing much help scientifically. But Taylor, you've got a friend that we chatted with, former commander of the International Space Station, Chris Hadfield. He has been to space, and a lot of our audience might actually know him as the astronaut who played David Bowie on the International Space Station.
Yep. All right, well, let's dive into it. Well, hey, Chris, thanks for joining us today. We were just talking about it. You're now a best-selling author. Is that something you ever thought would happen?
Well, there's never any guarantee in life. I've always loved writing. Like when I was a kid in school, it was my favorite subject. I was pretty sure though that if I took English or writing as my major in college, they weren't going to let me command a spaceship. So I studied engineering in school, but I've always liked writing, and I started with nonfiction because that's a little less tenuous, and maybe slightly less competitive because of the expertises that I have. Was then getting into writing fiction and thriller fiction. That's a pretty carnivorous environment. And yet, it's having great success and international bestsellers and being made into a television series. So yeah, I never could have predicted that it would be going as well as it is. But now I'm writing my third thriller fiction book in the Apollo Murders series, and it's a really fun new adjunct to all the other things I'm up to.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot, is that intersection between science fiction and science fact, and how a good piece of science fiction can really inspire people to think about science in a new way. So you bring so much, this wealth of knowledge and experience to writing science fiction, and so it's been really cool to read.
If you look at Asimov or Clarke, I mean, Arthur C. Clarke, he has an orbit named after him, and not to honor him, because he invented it. Like these folks were for real, and they weren't just very good writers and very good imaginers. But without them, without those science fiction writers, without the stuff that was brought to the screen, Star Trek in 2001, I probably never would have thought of doing all those things for myself. So yeah, it's important to have the facts right and the depth of it correct, but the artistic portrayal of it in some sort of fictional media is, I think, is really important. To be something, you've got to somehow see it when it doesn't exist yet. And so, yeah, media is super important.
Yeah, and having that grounded in scientific reality is really cool, and that's something I really like when I read a piece of science fiction. So now you're writing these books, but I wonder if you could just take us back, to how you got started in all this. I know you were a fighter pilot and a test pilot, but was being an astronaut something you always wanted to do? How did you kind of progress from that early interest in aviation and space to where you are now?
Yeah, I'm like some weird anomaly, I think, in that I consciously decided to become an astronaut when I was 9 years old. And it wasn't like I hope or I'm dreaming or, I want to be a fireman and a whatever. I saw what was happening, and I just said, well, that's the coolest thing that I can possibly imagine. That's what gets my heart beating. And like, if we can make our life do this thing, then let's do that. That's the coolest thing. And what planted both the seed of imagination and the certainty that that's what I wanted to do was a combination between fiction and nonfiction. The fictional side was probably started with comic books, Marvel, because everything's just so gloriously expanded and exciting, and everybody's muscular, and there's big stories happening. But that's okay. That's the world of a little kid. And then getting into more subtle investigations of it with writers like Bradbury or who are really use the language excellently, but then explore ideas, and then to have it happen for real on top of the fiction. That's what really cemented it for me. Here I am, a little kid reading this early science fiction, and then seeing that that people are doing this for real. While I'm watching these pretend things of Kirk and Uhura, exploring a 5-year mission, Strange New Worlds, Gagarin flies, and then Al Shepard flies, and then the whole Gemini program. And then, of course, the real watershed moment when Mike and Neil and Buzz went to the moon and Neil and Buzz walked on the surface. And that mixture set me up and then knocked it out of the park. The science fiction set it up, and then the reality of people actually doing it, that's what convinced me that, hey, maybe if they can do it, then why can't I do it? They're just people. And so I consciously decided, actually about 200 yards from where I'm sitting right now, I consciously decided, okay, that's what I want to do. What do I do next? What do I need to start changing? What do I change about myself? And that's what led to those other things you mentioned, Taylor, of being, I'm going to be an engineer because it's math and stuff. And I'm going to be a pilot because you fly spaceships. I'm going to be as demanding a pilot as possible, and that's to be a combat fighter pilot. And then as technical a pilot as I can be, which means an experimental test pilot. And then after all of that's when the opportunity came to get selected as an astronaut. So it was very deliberate, but it wasn't like a monocle. It wasn't just this or nothing. It was any one of those things. Okay, I can be an engineer for the rest of my life. I could be a professional pilot. I can be a top-end fighter pilot. I can be a test pilot for the rest of my life. All of those things were building opportunities for me, but that all fed into the long-term goal of maybe someday being able to fly in space, even command a spaceship. And amazingly, all those things happened.
And I'm sure everything you learned in your mechanical engineering degree and becoming a fighter pilot, flying F-18s, becoming a test pilot was transferable to when you became a shuttle pilot, piloting Soyuz, commanding the space station. How long did it take you from earning that mechanical engineering degree to the time that you first went into space?
Good question. My first degree, I graduated at 22, I guess. And I flew in space. So a little over a dozen years, 13 years from walking across the stage and getting my mech eng degree to main engine cutoff and being in orbit.
Yeah, not bad. So how many years were you actually a professional astronaut?
I was hired in the summer of 92. And I served for 21 years. And I'm Canadian. I was in Canadian Space Agency, and I was also in the Royal Canadian Air Force. But all those programs are international. And so as a member of the Air Force, I served with the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy. And then they are the ones, the Air Force loaned me sort of on secondment, which is a word I had to learn, to the Canadian Space Agency. And then as soon as they hired me, they immediately sent me down to be a NASA astronaut. And then amazingly, while I was a NASA astronaut, they made me their director of operations in Russia. So I was a Canadian military officer seconded to the Canadian Space Agency who had detailed me to NASA, who made them their director of operations living in Russia. So long and convoluted, but I served 21 years as a NASA astronaut with all of that international background. 21 years, every single day, either preparing for spaceflight directly, helping to invent spaceflight, perfecting and designing, or supporting other people who are flying in space. That, best 21 years of my life so far.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I'm sure you experienced a lot of changes in the 20 years you were there. And you started on Space Shuttle, then flew Soyuz. I mean, did it feel when you were at NASA like there was a lot of change happening? I mean, now we've seen this massive transition to commercial space flight. I mean, did it feel like changes were underway in the way that we did human space flight?
Well, God, I sure hope it's going to change. It was pretty primitive in 1961, and we needed to get better every time. And we got most things right. But, we killed the Apollo 1 crew. The Soviets killed a couple of crews. We killed the Challenger crew. We killed the Columbia crew. All of those were just the worst type of failure for us not recognizing the speed with which we needed to change things. And it's always been commercial. Even when Al Shepard flew, those were commercial companies building the hardware for the rocket and the spaceship, the little Mercury capsule that he flew. And the space shuttle that I helped fly was built by Rockwell and, all of that. So it's always been commercial companies. But the real question is, can we get the technology good enough that NASA doesn't have to specify every single thing the commercial company is going to build? Instead, like when you rent a car, you don't say, okay, and this is how I want the pinion bearings to work and the type of transmission gear metallurgy design. You just say, I just want a car that'll take me to Chicago and back. And then somebody else does all the engineering. And that's hopefully where we're getting to in space flight now, where NASA's done and the other space agencies have done all the hard and low profit work to get all that structure. And now companies can come in and not be told what to do, but instead just what the product they need to provide or the service they need to provide. And I think that's great. And I've been working to support that since the beginning. And I think the evolution mirrors the evolution in trains and boats and airplanes. You need that transitional period. And so I think it's excellent, and I don't think it's ever been more exciting than to have new companies launching new spaceships that can take people to space and testing new technologies and bringing together all of the cool stuff, the metallurgy and high-speed processing and three-dimensional positioning from GPS and understanding of the upper atmosphere and all of that, that wouldn't have been possible 15 years ago. But now we can do these things. So I feel like I've been sort of both a witness and a contributor to that my whole life.
Is there anything about this new commercial industry in space, the transition from the established players to new players like SpaceX and Crew Dragon and Starship and Boeing with Starliner? Is there anything about that new commercial space industry that has been surprising to you?
Yeah, SpaceX surprised the hell out of me, because when they were start talking back in 07, 08, I thought, yeah, big talker. But what you're talking about, we've been thinking about, when we designed the space shuttle, we said, okay, we want to make it 100% reusable. Well, we can't reuse the gas tank, but those two big solid rockets, we could fly them back and land them on a runway. We didn't have the technology yet, and what are we going to put a pilot at each one of those big solid rockets and fly them back? It's just crazy. So we compromised, but we built the greatest spaceship to that point ever built and flew it 135 times. This was the moment in history when all of the necessary technological building blocks were just coming together enough to enable it. It was like going to Antarctica in 1911. Scott froze to death, right? Amundsen made it, but just barely. But then within 5 years, we were flying airplanes to Antarctica. It's like, wow, why didn't we just wait 5 years? Would have been way better. And so when in history does the technology come together? And at the time, I just thought, I've flown in space twice. I know better. And I'm really pleased to have people prove me wrong whenever possible. And I'm if anything, it just reaffirms my belief of my own culpability and limitations, but also to count and bank on the imagination and brilliance of and tenacity and work of other people to get some amazing collective stuff done.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of Space Shuttle as a kind of iterative step in this process of creating, truly reusable spacecraft. I'm sure when Space Shuttle was conceived and originally designed, the engineers thought of it as a more reusable vehicle than it ended up being. But I guess, it really was a step in this iterative design process towards reusable spacecraft.
If you look at aviation, look at all the ridiculous airplane designs of the 1900s, teens, 20s, even 30s. There was just, everybody tried everything, put the tail on the front, land on the water, do all kinds of stuff, But it took, you have to try all that stuff. It's like a kid learning to walk. And eventually you start coming up with, this is the way airplanes kind of need to be shaped, engine here, wings there, tail there, wheels there. It's eventually form follows function and it sorts itself out. And spaceships, same thing. At first we thought, spaceship has to be pointy. And then Max Faget and his team said, no, your spaceship has to be blunt if it's going to come back through the atmosphere, because whatever your pointy thing is, there's no way it can take the heat of pushing back against the air molecules. There is no material that can be strung out. It'll just burn off. So what you need is like if you stick your finger in a fire, if you can put a whole big hot glove in there, it can absorb the heat over a large surface for a longer time. And so we've been iterating on spaceship design. And we thought, hey, spaceship, nice compromise. Space shuttle, nice compromise. Wings. What we learned is spaceships shouldn't have wings, really, because for almost their entire flight, the wings are nothing but mass and volume that you don't really want. And is there some other way to come down through the atmosphere rather than like an airplane? And maybe for specific designs, wings are good. But generically, we're now getting, if you look at the Starship, a big blunt body, or the Dragon capsule or the other capsules, that's kind of the natural form follows function efficient design for a spaceship. It'll be different landing on the moon. It'll be different landing on Mars, just because the physics, the environment's different. But for Earth, we're slowly now getting to the point of, okay, this is the optimized design, and now we're just refining that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good segue. We've seen all of these really exciting robotic missions like Curiosity and Perseverance, and then future missions like Dragonfly. And so, you're a human astronaut. So, can you make the case for why sending humans into space is important? That we can do things that robotic probes just can't do?
People and animals, they're the only things that matter. Robots don't. They don't care. They don't matter. They're just. I mean, if I say to you 76 degrees, if you're a thermometer, you're like, yep, here it is. I'm showing you 76 degrees. I'm a thermometer. That's my job. I'm telling you 76 degrees. But temperature means something to a human. And the difference between 76 below and 76 above doesn't mean anything to a thermometer. It's just a thing. It's just data. But the meaning of life is entirely up to us and to other animals, and so it's always got to be both. We harnessed fire 500,000 years ago, and we started with shelter and clothing and tools and trying to improve the quality of life by building primitive machinery and harnessing energy, and we need that. We no one could live in Canada, nobody, without technology. The winter would kill you.
Yep,
But we sort of take it for granted. And so you just extrapolate that out. People have been living north of the tree line for 6,000 years because they had the technology to live in that place with early forms of technology. And robots are just another form of technology. And so we need them as well as the whole purpose for doing it, which is people. So as machines have more decision-making capability, it just frees us up a little bit, so I've flown a lot of different airplanes. Some of them where all the decisions are mine, and some of them where a lot of the decisions are being handled by the primitive thinking capability of early AI. And the airplanes where we've harnessed some of that computer thinking capability, the airplanes can do stuff like an F-18 flying at high angle of attack or maneuvering crazily, or an F-16, which wouldn't fly at all. It's inherently unstable. It wouldn't fly for 3 seconds without the high-speed computing, but it frees up us, the people, then to do stuff that otherwise we'd be denied. And that includes orbiting the Earth, living on the moon, eventually living on Mars. So it's always going to be both. It's a specious argument to say one or the other. It's always got to be both. But the only part of it that really matters is us.
Why do we want to live on Mars? And then, what are the steps that we need to take to get there?
Why does anybody want to live anywhere? It's kind of a fundamental question. You probably don't live in the same house that your parents brought you back to when you were born. You've probably at some point got enough skills. You went to kindergarten and you got to high school, and then somewhere in high school you said, this place is okay, but wow, there's a lot of the rest of the world. And as soon as I get enough skills and opportunity, I'm going to go somewhere else. That's why we're going to Mars. That's why we're going everywhere. Otherwise, we would all just stay home. We learn to walk about a year before, or maybe a year and a half before we learn to talk. It is absolutely necessary to go explore for us to be human. You have to go try stuff. You have to see stuff. You have to lick it and, learn about it on an interactive basis. And that's how we spread all over the surface of the world. It's how we got to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. It's how we got into the air. It's how we got to the space station. It's how we got to the moon. And so if you could get to Mars for free with no danger in the next 10 minutes, you'd go. But it's still now beyond our capability to send people to Mars, or at least beyond our risk tolerance. But eventually we'll invent machines that make travel to Mars, somewhere in the order of, stock car racing or something, or deep sea fishing where there's a certain danger involved, or bungee jumping, which people do all the time. And so eventually it'll be just another place that people go and people live. But right now it is so dangerous because our technology is so primitive that it is vastly expensive and very, very risky. And that's why we haven't done it yet, because it's not worth the trade-off. But eventually we'll get there.
As we're talking about going to Mars and the things we'll learn when we finally get there, it occurs to me that you've spent your life training for becoming an astronaut, training on these different vehicles like Space Shuttle and then Soyuz. You've done so much training in the laboratory, in simulators. And I just wonder, are there things that you couldn't train for, things that you couldn't predict that surprised you when you got into space for the first time?
Something I learned a long time ago is all simulators are wrong. And as soon as you start believing your simulator, you're setting yourself up for a bad surprise. So as a fighter pilot, I kind of thought, well, these simulators are pretty good and pretty realistic. As a test pilot, I learned the difference between a bad simulation and a proper simulation, or at least recognizing the limitations of your simulation can be life or death. And so you have to go in knowing, okay, this simulator is wrong, but this piece of it is pretty close to reality. And we can draw some useful conclusions from that. And my whole life as an astronaut was simulating and preparing so that when the real event happened, we would have seen enough variety in imperfect simulations that we had the capacity and the depth to be able to react appropriately to succeed. That's why we simulate so much. And almost nothing on my space flight, especially the shuttle flights, which are short and kind of hyperactive, almost nothing went as planned. And I was struck with some really serious problems. We were docked to the space station on my second flight, and all of the computers that controlled the space station, all the main command and control computers, started overwriting their hard drives and went completely stupid. And the space station was tumbling through space, and had to recover from all of that. On my third flight, I was blinded during my first spacewalk. Both my eyes got contamination in them. And how do you deal with that? And then we did an operating system upgrade on the International Space Station when I was there, and it failed, and it shut down everything, and we had to reboot the whole station and bring it back under control. Yeah, all that stuff happens. So the reason you simulate is not to be ready for the right answer. It's to be ready for all of the things that are going to go wrong, so you've got the capacity to react appropriately. And that's what astronauts do for a living, is prepare for things to go wrong, not for things to go right. And it's kind of a misimpression of what the life of an astronaut actually is.
Were you ever scared in space? Did you ever have moments of like real fear?
No, but that's not because it wasn't dangerous or because I'm an idiot. Space flight and launch, my odds of dying during my first shuttle launch were 1 in 38. So, that's pretty bad odds for life or death. That's in the first 8.5 minutes. So, but fear and danger are not synonyms. They're not the same thing. We tend to use them like, oh, that's a scary thing. Things aren't scary. Just some subset of the population is scared. But if the greatest antidote for fear is competence. And once you're good at something, the danger doesn't change, like riding a bike. Riding a bike's dangerous. You break your teeth, break your skull, people fall off their bike, whatever. But as soon as you've learned how and someone's helped you and you've mastered the skill, then the bike doesn't change, the danger doesn't change. But because you have changed, therefore, you don't have to be afraid anymore. And a spaceship is just a complicated bicycle. So if you can learn how and train and change who you are and develop a whole new skill set, then even though the danger is elevated, you have a lot more things going for you than just fear.
Knowledge is the antidote to fear. I like that as a closing thought.
Yeah. It's a nice sentiment to think about, and I think it really kind of gives us that hope, moving further into space, into the solar system and beyond. And Taylor, I'm kind of curious, what is that next step? Where are we moving next? Is it Mars? That's kind of what I see in the news, right?
Yeah, well, I think myself and a lot of people are very excited about Mars. There's a lot of interesting science, whether it's geology or mineralogy or even potentially biology, that we can do when we get there. So Mars, from a science standpoint, is really interesting. But the moon still has a lot of science and exploration to be done. I think people thought, we did all this exploration in the early 70s and 1969, and that, we basically learned all there is to know about the moon. But there's still a lot of interesting things that studying the geology and mineralogy of the moon can tell us about Earth. And it's kind of an outpost on the way to Mars. You could think of it almost as maybe like a refueling stop, like a gas station. We found so much water on the moon in the last few decades that really we didn't even know was there in the 1960s and 70s, that can potentially be used for fuel and for oxygen, for deeper missions into the solar system. And there are these different camps, right? There are people that think we should go, they call them Mars Direct, straight to Mars and not worry about the moon. Okay. There are people that think that the moon and the lunar gateway is kind of a stepping stone to Mars. But the good news is there's very fascinating science that can be done all these places. And certainly I think Mars is, one of the next big adventures for humanity. Yeah.
One thing that was talked about was this, the privatized space industry, right? I think that's something you hear a lot about too. We talked about how the space industry in some ways has always been private. NASA may have controlled these rockets, but the parts were all made by private industry. But what does it mean to actually, make the whole thing private? If it's completely run by SpaceX or Blue Origin or Virgin Galactic, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, I think it's just a different concept for how NASA contracts these missions, and as opposed to being very prescriptive in the way they do it, meaning, they go to Rockwell or they go to Rocketdyne and say, hey, we need a rocket that does, this thing with this engine, with this number of stages that can launch off this kind of launch pad. NASA's kind of gone to this commercial contracting model where they say, we don't really care how you get there. We just need you to send, 3 or 6 astronauts to the space station or to the lunar gateway or to the lunar surface. You figure out how to do it. And in some ways that has real advantages. It takes NASA's kind of efforts away from the engineering of the technical solution and more towards, what are the kind of the science goals and the overarching mission architectures that will allow us to achieve those. So, those are the kind of changes I think we've seen in the last 10 years when it comes to commercial space.
I just feel like I'm kind of skeptical, right, of I know the privatized industry, right? I think a lot of people, when they hear private industry, they're like, oh, do I trust them over NASA? I mean, NASA, I think, is kind of one of the most trusted government agencies, right, that we have.
Well, it's a good point, but I think there's a couple things to think about. One is that, obviously, when, say, SpaceX or Boeing creates a spacecraft that, meets one of these mission requirements, NASA is in the room. They're in all of these design reviews. They're on the factory floor, and they're basically keeping an eye on these companies, making sure, they meet the kind of quality control and quality assurance standards that, you would expect NASA to require. So that's part of it. And then the other thing to understand is, I think in most aspects of commercial space, agencies like NASA, ESA, the European Space Agency, and these international space agencies, they're really driving the science. They're driving the mission requirements. So they kind of decide where we're going to go, what we want to do when we get there, and things like that. And then they ask private industry to give them the platform to do it. Now, there are obviously exceptions to this, right? Elon Musk's whole kind of vision around SpaceX is to colonize Mars, to occupy Mars or whatever. And when it comes to these kind of privately funded space missions, I think you have to be a little careful, right? Things around planetary protection and preserving the kind of science you're able to do there becomes important. But most of what we see today is not really private industry setting off on their own. They are acting as a partner to these agencies that have really, really well thought out mission designs. And they're taking the burden off NASA of having to figure out exactly how to make the rocket or make the technology platform.
Is there a future, though, where they are setting off on their own, these private space industry? They don't have to get permission from NASA, and they could just be like, all right, I'm going to the moon. You can't say yes or no, where they're just sending them up there.
That's technically true, right? NASA does not sign off and say, hey, you can go to the moon or you can go to Mars.
Wow. I kind of thought they did.
Now, there are obviously FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and FCC, Federal Communication Commission requirements. They give launch licenses and things like that. But as far as, SpaceX or Blue Origin or a company like this saying, oh, we're going to go put people on the moon or on Mars, there's nothing stopping them from doing that. But I do think, one of the things we have to be a little careful about, and I think we will see this happen, and I think there are definitely upsides and positive, aspects to that happening, is making sure that we maintain these places as outposts of science, right? So that we're not dumping a lot of trash or contaminating an environment that might have extraterrestrial life with Earth life. So these things are important to keep in mind. And there is a lot of thought within both the U.S. and at NASA and the international space community of how you put in a set of guidelines so that it's done responsibly.
Okay. So what then are some of the prevailing technologies that we're going to be using to, get to those next steps? Get to the moon, get to Mars, get to the outer solar system and beyond. What are we using right now, and what are kind of the future technologies looking like?
I mean, and that's what excites me so much right now is that we finally entered this era of like reusable heavy lift rockets, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that 15 years ago was unthinkable, right? Both of those. I mean, we did not have heavy lift rockets that had the kind of capability that the Saturn V had during the Apollo program. And we certainly did not have reusable rockets.
And these heavy lift rockets, what are they? Like, they just need to be able to lift like X amount of weight. And we haven't really, everything we're setting up is kind of like really light.
Yeah. I mean, you think about even these really big rovers like Curiosity and Perseverance that launched on an Atlas V, even though they're very big, by comparison of what it'll take to have a human spaceflight architecture, they're actually pretty small because once you put people there, you have to have life support.
Yeah, we're sending houses up to the moon now, right? So
yeah, I mean, these are very big things, and so they require a lot of mass to orbit. But that's, to me, the most exciting thing that's happening, honestly, in like all of engineering right now is these heavy lift,
is it like the
reusable
fuel?
architectures.
Is that why they're lifting it more? Like, what are why are these working now? And in the past we didn't have them.
Well, a lot of things. I think one is SpaceX has really driven this kind of reusable architecture, and having a reusable architecture allows you to do things that if it's a single-use rocket, you really couldn't do. But mostly, I think it's mission requirements, right? Like, we now want to launch significantly heavier payloads to orbit or significantly more complex payloads. So all of this goes back to lowering the cost to orbit, the cost of launch. So the price per kilogram to either low Earth orbit or geostationary orbit or, inserting into a lunar or Martian orbit. It's all about the dollar per kilogram number. And the bigger the rocket, especially if it's reusable, the lower that cost per kilogram to orbit. And so that's really what's driving this is trying to lower that cost. And so we now have architectures like Starship, which are fully reusable systems that can launch large amounts of payload to orbit and beyond low Earth orbit. And those are super exciting architectures that are going to allow us to go back to the moon and allow us to go to Mars and honestly do a whole bunch of other things, even in deep space.
So like if I in the 70s, launching this pen into orbit would cost $1 million or something, right? And now it's costing us like $300,
Yeah, well,
some probably a little bit different than that. But.
Yeah, I mean, you could think of it really as orders of magnitude reduction, in cost. So, from hundreds of thousands of dollars per kilogram to tens of thousands to $1,000 per kilogram or potentially lower. That's kind of the step change or the sea change in the cost of launch. And when we talk about human spaceflight, we really talk about human-rated vehicles. And, SpaceX has thought all along about human-rated vehicles. So they started out with the Falcon 1, that wasn't human-rated. Then they built the Falcon 9, and that was a human-rated rocket. And that's taking astronauts back to the space station and low Earth orbit. And the next generation of SpaceX rocket, the Starship system, that'll be a human-rated rocket as well. And so there's a lot that goes into that. And really, it's just the risk of losing a vehicle is lower. Obviously, if you have a very expensive satellite, you don't want to lose it, but it's not, the worst day in the world if the rocket blows up. But if there are people on board, it's a really bad day. And, we've learned a lot really from the last, 60 years of human spaceflight, that building safe, reliable launch vehicles is very important. And the space shuttle, really, its death knell was the failure rate of the vehicle. It was not as safe of a rocket as it was originally intended to be, as safe of a spacecraft or a launch system as it was originally intended to be. And so as we move forward, we just want to develop not only all of these like really enabling technologies like reusability and heavy lift and things like that, but also make sure that we have these really reliable launch vehicles and make something that is, more akin to commercial aviation than it is, high risk space travel.
Okay, well, hey, commercial aviation, that's making me think, I said that I'd like to stay here on Earth in the future, but you said you would be willing to go up there if you could do some science. In the future, could you just be like, hey, I want to go up to the moon and, test out some microbes or, see what happens if I eat a whole thing of cotton candy? I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a good question. And I think we are moving to that point. Obviously, we're not there today, but the idea is if NASA can kind of focus on the big picture and the science, private industry can take up the mantle of everything that's easy to do, low Earth orbit, maybe transiting to the moon. And in that way, if you can kind of set up a private industry where there's like incentives for companies to do this, if you can get that price down low enough through that kind of incentive system, I don't see why you couldn't see regular missions, for civilians, for your average person to either low Earth orbit or, out beyond that.
Yeah. So are there like middle schoolers today that could be, one day just, taking a taxi up to the moon or something?
I think that's within the realm of possibility. And I mean, I think today's astronaut classes NASA have will be certainly going to the moon, but probably Mars. And so, I think, and we'll see how this prediction holds up, but I think we are entering a real golden era of human space exploration. Yeah, so Joey, I know you're a big fan of science fiction. Is there any kind of depiction of human spaceflight and science fiction that is like exciting to you or maybe scary to you?
Well, I just finished reading Project Hail Mary. And I thought that was such
Andy Weir's great.
Yeah, it was awesome. And he's such a fun author. And definitely it's kind of a scary story in terms of like, humanity is like on the brink of extinction. This guy has to go out into space to save it, which is such a fun story. But I felt like it was kind of hopeful in that, humanity had to come together to like send this guy off to a different, far off galaxy.
Oh, that's a good point. And I think that's something to be said for human spaceflight is it has always been a very connecting force. I mean, we even go back to the height of the Cold War. I mean, the height of the space race.
Yeah.
And there was real collaboration and communication between these two sworn enemies, the United States and the USSR. And I think that's interesting, right? I think those optics, you may say it's performative, but those optics of, an American astronaut and a Soviet cosmonaut reaching out in the Apollo-Soyuz mission is really powerful. That's one thing to be said today for human spaceflight is as bad as U.S.-Russian relations have gotten with the war in Ukraine, the relationship between the U.S. and Russia, as far as it comes to a collaboration, especially aboard the International Space Station, has still remained pretty intact. And, it may be the last little shred of goodwill between the two countries, but I think that's something that will enable cooperation, throughout this new era of human spaceflight. As we go back to the moon and as we go to Mars, no one country possesses all the technology and resources to go it alone. We wouldn't want to. And so, part of the Artemis Accords are these contracts that agreements and memorandums of understanding we've signed with a whole host of nations. And similar to the Artemis Accords, the first crewed mission to Mars will be a similar kind of international collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, I covered politics for like 10 years when I was, reporting more regularly, and it definitely kind of fractured my hope for humanity. But science reporting and science journalism and, talking about space and stuff, I feel like is so much more hopeful and like I think is, repaired a lot of that. If you're only focusing on one type of news for so long, it can get a little bit depressing. But this is one area that I love to see, bringing people together and creating hope. And that kind of brings me to this last question I had for you, which is that you and Chris were talking about how being wrong in science is actually exciting in a lot of ways. And I love that. I love the fact that, hey, if I'm wrong, like that's awesome. Like that's a learning point. Is that something that you kind of, are coming across on a day-to-day basis in science?
Oh, absolutely. And, I tell students and people I talk to all the time, scientists that are convinced they know it all aren't really good scientists. I mean, the basis of science is the idea that you don't know everything.
So you're saying that I wouldn't be a good scientist because I'm right all this time.
I don't know about that, but no, I love to be proven wrong. That is honestly the most interesting part of my day is when I can be proven wrong. Because that means we're learning something new. And so I think there is really within science this understanding that, it's you don't know everything. It's okay to be wrong. And it's even more than okay to be wrong. It's actually the best part of science when you are wrong.
The best part of my day is when I can prove you wrong. I love proving you wrong. I remember one time you told me that frogs were the only amphibians, and I was very excited to tell you.
I don't know if I said that, Joey.
But yeah, Taylor, this has been such a great chat, and I feel like I have such a better understanding of where we're going into space. We've got a lot to think about when it comes to the
definitely
future.
Some interesting thoughts and concepts.
So thank you so much for chatting with me about all this.
Yeah, absolutely, and our thanks to Chris Hadfield, fighter pilot, test pilot extraordinaire, Canadian Space Agency astronaut, NASA astronaut, space shuttle astronaut, International Space Station commander. Pretty interesting guy.
Well, Taylor, that's a heck of a resume.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, thank you guys for joining us. Hope you'll join us next time on Giant Leap.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.